Does the frequency of these tragedies, have you noticed it making a difference? I mean, let's take the mass shootings. It seems like there's a higher volume of them. Certainly aggregating the funds for the victims makes sense. But as we see more climate disaster, as we see more mass shootings, is that having an impact on what the remedies are?
Well, it's not having any impact that I can see on dollars.
Okay.
It is having an impact on what is the appropriate venue and forum for resolving mass claims. It used to be that if you had a mass disaster, you would file a class action, like back in the 1980s with Agent Orange and Vietnam veterans. And
which you were involved in,
action,
right?
That's right. The class action was the favored device. The Supreme Court, over the last 20 or 30 years, has restricted the use of the class action in the mass claims situation. And that's what I think has resulted in lawyers gravitating to the bankruptcy courts as a potential option for speedy, relatively speaking, speedy resolution and prompt compensation. Now, whether the bankruptcy courts were ever intended to be a forum for mass claims, that's an interesting issue. But again, I think the Supreme Court will have to decide that ultimately.
So, Ken, you're still called in many times when there's a crisis. Let's call in Ken Feinberg. There's a lot of discussion now around AI. No, you're irreplaceable, of course. But what role do you think, as we look at AI as in terms of quantifying damages, dispensing remedies, does it give you pause to think about this being done by an algorithm?
Yes, it does give me pause. I always question the value of methodology or algorithm when what you really want to know is the pros and cons of victims, what they confront, the unique circumstances surrounding the tragedy. There's a big difference between a hurricane or a tsunami causing terrible death and injury versus a BP where there's or a 9/11 where there's human fault. I'm dubious about taking the variables that go into an analysis of harm and victim impact and coming up with some sort of algorithm, as you say, that might be used as a substitute. You have all sorts of methodologies in mass claims, all sorts of them, but they are grounded in individual human consideration, how it will impact individuals. I'm a little dubious about AI and robotic, automatic assembly line calculations.
So let me switch to Maui right now and climate disasters. BP obviously was one. There was a very, as you mentioned, there was a company that was clearly culpable, or multiple companies actually. What, in these situations where it's almost existential, act of God, certainly there's insurance to be dispensed. What do you think has changed? What advice do you have? Because there's a lot of people who have incurred a lot of damage, and there may be a quick.
Well, I think you've got to sit down, and when you start talking about mass damage, well, you have intimated, you have inferred some of the important questions. One, mass damage, who's responsible? Two, what are we talking about in terms of the political support for the creation of some sort of specialized fund? Three, even if you've got that political support, what is the source of the funds? Four, how much will the fund produce in the way of distribution to victims? Five, who are the victims? In Maui, I read, like you do on the front page, there are deaths, there are physically injured, there is property damage. I mean, there are all sorts of potential eligible victims. And you've got to begin to develop sort of a design architecture answering those questions step by step by step as you attempt to come up with a viable amount of money that will be available subject to rules, very transparent rules governing distribution, eligibility, amounts. Um, you start doing that as soon as you think it's appropriate. But I must say, first and foremost, bad things happen to good people every day in this country. There's
Yeah.
no fund. If you're going to have a fund, is there the political will? Is there the political consensus to develop such a fund because of the unique circumstances of the tragedy?